the leaders of the day, the Pharisees, the religious leaders were always trying to trick Jesus and trap him, and they were trying to find something to peg on him. You know, they were looking for anything. It didn't matter what it was. They just wanted something to stick. And it kind of reminded me of Al Capone. If you know who Al Capone is, some of you may. He was a mob boss of the Chicago outfit. And this was many, many years ago. He was a gangster. He was a bootlegger. He was a racketeer. He was the mastermind behind the Valentine Day massacre. And you know what he was ultimately arrested for? Tax evasion. Because apparently illegal income is still subject to income tax. You know, it's like you think they would just let that one pass, but no, they're like, no, all that illegal money you made, you still have to pay taxes on it. And so they arrested him for, not for all the other horrible things that he did, but they arrested him for tax evasion. And that's kind of like what they were trying to do with Jesus, except Jesus was not a mob boss or a gangster. They were just trying to find anything that would stick. They watched him like a hawk. Every move, they figured eventually he's going to mess up. I mean, they had 613 religious laws. They're like, surely he won't be perfect on all of them. Surely we'll be able to find something that we can get him for. And so that brings us to what we're talking about today in Luke chapter 6, verse 1. It says, one Sabbath day, as Jesus was walking through some grain fields, his disciples broke off some heads of grain, rubbed off the husks in their hand, and ate the grain. Now, I have some grain with me today. Now we don't know exactly what it was. In some translations, it says it was corn. Some people think that it could have been barley, it could have been wheat. I don't know, but corn was easier accessible, and it's a little more visual. So it says here, they broke off some of the heads of grain. You know, it's a little bit of effort to get into this thing. How many layers does it go? There we go. They broke off some heads of grain, they rubbed off the husks in their hand, and they ate the grain. But some Pharisees saw this happening, and they said, why are you breaking the law by harvesting grain on the Sabbath? Now here they are. They're out there. They're hungry. They see some corn maybe, some wheat, some barley. We don't know. They didn't cook it. They just ate it. Like, this isn't the best meal in the world, right? But at least it was something. Now, you might be thinking, well, what are they doing? Stealing food from somebody else's field. Well, there was a provision in Jewish law, and it was called the law of gleaning. And what that meant was that when the harvest time would come, the farmer was not supposed to pick the entire field clean. That they should leave some around the edges of the field for the poor people or travelers. And even if you were traveling and the harvest had not come yet, you could still go and you could take some from the edges and you could have what you needed. Like, you couldn't go and harvest the field and take all of it, but you could go and take just what you needed to have a meal to alleviate the hunger that you have. And that's what the disciples are doing here. They got some grain. They're shucking it. They're doing whatever. They're having a little snack on the way. And it says, the Pharisees said, why are you breaking the law by harvesting grain on the Sabbath? Now, what is the Sabbath? The Sabbath is the seventh day of the week, basically. This was an ordinance put into play by God at creation. When God created the heavens and the earth, they created the heavens and the earth in 6 days, and Scripture says on the seventh day, God rested. It wasn't because he was so tired. It was just because he was setting into play this ordinance of the Sabbath. In your notes, the Sabbath was a promise of rest, saying that you can toil, you can work, but after that, comes rest. Later on in the wilderness, God gives the commandments to Moses. And the fourth commandment was to honor the Sabbath day. And so they were to keep the Sabbath day holy. They were not supposed to work on the Sabbath day. When God provided manna for them, they were not allowed to collect it on the Sabbath day. They were supposed to collect it the day before. This is the seventh day of the week. This is our Saturday. It was the last day of the week, and they were to keep that day holy. There was a guy in the Old Testament, and he knew this law, and he went out and just decided he was going to pick up some sticks. He was going to gather some wood for firewood. And the whole community saw this, and they asked God what they should do. And as horrible as it sounds, they ended up putting him to death for violating this rule of the Sabbath. Well, as the years went by, they would ponder the question, what does it mean to work? What does it mean to work? And so the Sabbath then became, they instituted 39 different categories of rules for what work meant. That all these different categories like planting and plowing and reaping and sewing clothes and skinning animals and writing down things, or even completing something. Like you couldn't complete anything. And out of these 39 rules, there was all these sub-rules, and you would have to study them. And even to this day, many of these rules, they have to figure out what the modern implications are. For example, on the Sabbath day, it is unlawful for them to start a fire, so that actually prevents Jews from driving in an automobile, because to crank up the car in an internal combustion engine would be creating a fire. Some of you say, well, that's okay, I've got an electric car. Well, to start the electric car, you have to complete a circuit, and there is no completion either allowed on the Sabbath day. You know, you're not allowed to unattach something from something else. Not even if it's perforated, you can't detach something. So that means we're gonna get a little talking dirty here for a second, okay? If you're going to the bathroom, you can't rip off the toilet paper, okay? So you'd have to prepare in advance, and you'd have to rip it all off into the right size pieces, so that on the Sabbath on the Sabbath day you couldn't do it. Or you could bring Kleenex, apparently, because you're not ripping anything. It's like the level of detail that they would think through. You can't carry something from a private domain into a public domain. That means that you couldn't carry something for more than a few steps off of your own property. So if you had a child, if you had a purse, if you had something that you were carrying somewhere, you couldn't carry that off of the property. And as you can imagine, that becomes very, very cumbersome. Like, how can you go anywhere if you can't carry anything with you? So in Jewish fashion, they started gathering and saying, well, what does this really mean? And what loopholes can we make? So they decided that if they put a wall around the city, that they could declare the entire city as a private area, and then you could move freely within the city on a Sabbath, carrying whatever you wanted, because now it's essentially private property. Well, as you can imagine, as time progressed and as technology progressed, it became increasingly difficult to build walls around cities. So they said, you know what? Somebody decided, I don't know who decided, that we'll make a virtual wall, a symbolic wall of sorts. And so they have something called an eruv. And an eruv is a wire that goes around a city, symbolically representing a wall. The largest one is in Manhattan. It's about 18 foot up, and it goes 18 miles around Manhattan Island. It costs them around $100,000 a year to maintain this wire. But this eruv makes sure that all of Manhattan is considered a private area. So they can walk anywhere they want to. They can carry whatever they want to, as long as they're within the confines of this wire. There's over 200 of these across North America. And every week on Thursday, a rabbi drives the entire length, making sure it is intact and it has not broken, because if it broke, well, then they would not be able to move freely throughout their city. The Sabbath day. Another thing that some people of the Jewish faith would do is they would have someone called a Sabbath goy. And what a Sabbath goy was a Sabbath goy was a non-Jew that they could basically have around to do all the things that they couldn't do themselves. So they would have them be there, and they could turn on the lights, and they could cook, and they could do all these things. The problem was you can't tell them what to do on the Sabbath, but you would have to tell them in advance what you want done and when you wanted it, and then they could do that. Some notable Sabbath goys was Elvis Presley, Colin Powell, and the former President Barack Obama were Sabbath goys, going around and doing the things that the Jewish people could not do. Elevators, you can't push a button on an elevator on the Sabbath because you're completing a circuit. So many elevators in the city have what they call a Sabbath mode, means it stops at every single floor, so you don't have to push a button when you board. Imagine getting to the 37th floor, having to wait at every floor to get there. So finally, though, the Pharisees found what they were looking for. They see Jesus' closest friends, his disciples, publicly disregarding these rules. They're harvesting, they're threshing, they're winnowing, they're eating this food that they harvested right there on the Sabbath. Jesus should have known better. He should have taught his followers better. This was a rookie mistake in their minds. Goes on in verse 3 of Luke 6. Jesus replied, "Haven't you read in the scriptures what David did when his companions were hungry? He went into the house of God and broke the law by eating the sacred loaves of bread that only the priest could eat. And then he also gave some to his companions." Well, in the Old Testament, this is long before Jesus was on the scene, they had a tabernacle and a temple where they would worship God. And every week on the Sabbath, they would bring these specially prepared loaves of bread that they would put in the presence of God. And then they would remove the bread from the previous week, and the priests would eat that bread from the previous week. And so every week they would do this, and only the priests could eat them, but David and his men were hungry, so they came in and they asked the priest, and he gave it to them, and they ate it. And it was most likely on the Sabbath while they were swapping out the bread. They're eating this. This was illegal in their time. But everyone here, the Pharisees, the religious leaders, they all revered David. And Jesus is pointing out simply that David broke a rule in order to take care of his men. And Jesus was simply doing the same thing. See, there was a Sabbath exception. There was an exception to all the rules on the Sabbath. And it was to save a life. In your notes, saving life always took priority on the Sabbath. So if you saw someone hurting or dying or in need, you could break the Sabbath rules in order to save a life. Continuing in verse 5 of Luke 6, Jesus says, "The Son of Man is Lord even over the Sabbath." Those are fighting words. Like he's saying, I am Lord over the Sabbath. Here you are criticizing my followers for taking a little bit of grain on the Sabbath and eating it, but I am Lord over the Sabbath. Imagine how shocking that would be to these religious leaders who all of their life, they were following the tiniest Sabbath law. He's claiming that he's above all of the Sabbath rules, but it was true. After all, he is the one who created the Sabbath. He created it at creation when they created for 6 days, and on the seventh day, God rested. He created it not because he was tired, but to foreshadow a rest that we would all be able to enter in. See, Jesus is saying that he is Lord over all, not just Lord over the Sabbath, a Saturday, but he's Lord over all the days of the week. And they were more concerned about following a series of rules than about following the Messiah. Are we more focused on following rules in life, or are we focused on following the Messiah? In your notes, we are called to follow Jesus, not a bunch of rules. We're not called to live a rules-based life. We're called to follow Jesus, walking in his steps.